As somebody who lives here in the United States, in Bible Belt, red state, Oklahoma, Iran sometimes seems like another planet. And especially when we see the headlines, going, we become disconnected. And I get frustrated with my fellow countrymen and women, and sometimes with myself about that disconnect, especially seeing the rampant human rights atrocities that are going on and have been going on that seem to really be boiling over. I wanted to talk about Iran with someone who knows what they're talking about. So, of course, I called my dear friend Maryam Namazie, and I begged her, please join me for a conversation. It's so good to see you, Maryam.
Oh, it's lovely to be here, Seth. Thank you so much for having me. As always, it's a big pleasure. And especially because I think this is such an important issue, and I do think it should be closer to people's hearts, because there's just such a lot of humanity coming out of the protests in Iran. It's so universal what they're fighting for. So I'm glad we're getting this chance to talk about what's happening there.
Iran, a nation of over 80 million people. Islam has been the official religion of Iran since the 7th century. 90% Shia, 10% Sunni. Religion is said to be on the decline. I'm guessing a lot of that is sort of under the radar. Maryam, there are these amazing photographs from Iran before the Islamic Revolution of 1979 and after. Can you tell me about these two Irans and what the hell happened?
Well, I mean, definitely when you look at photographs of Iran before the Islamic regime took power, it's a very different image, isn't it? There's no compulsory veiling. There's a lot more freedom compared to today. But we mustn't forget that even during the Shah's time, it was a dictatorship, which is why there was a revolution that took place in 1979. It wasn't an Islamic revolution, but it was expropriated by the Islamic movement. So what ended up being a revolution against dictatorship for freedom became, effectively, it turned into an Islamic state. And actually, a lot of people were killed in order for the Islamic regime to take power and create an Islamic state in Iran. So now we look to today, which is 44 years past that date, and we're seeing this magnificent protest movement in Iran. I'm calling it a women's revolution. Even if people don't call it a women's revolution, it is definitely a revolution that is led by women and girls. And the main slogan of this revolution is woman, life, freedom. And there's, it's such a secular, such a modern, such a human revolution and movement. And also, really, you can see a really deep anti-clericalism and even anti-religious sentiments. And I think some of the things we've talked about, you and I have talked about over the years, and the fact that there is this tsunami of atheism in Iran, but in other countries too, where Islam is in power, I think we're seeing that in reality playing out in the protests that has been going on since September 16th, the latest round of protests, since a young 22-year-old woman called Mahsa Jina Amini, she's a Kurdish woman, she was killed by the Islamic regime's morality police because a few strands of her hair were showing through her hijab. As you know, hijab is compulsory in Iran. She was murdered as a result. And since then, since her death on September 16th, there have been daily protests in Iran. It's been ongoing, and the Iranian regime is facing the greatest challenge it has since it was established over 40 years ago.
Violence escalating on the streets of Iran as protests enter their third month. Police crackdowns becoming more brutal. Videos posted on social media show a crowd inside a packed subway station fleeing security forces as they open fire with metal pellets. People panicked, rushing for the exits as officers keep shooting. In another video, police are seen storming one of the trains, beating protesters who tried to escape through the subway. Protesters are gaining momentum as they mark the anniversary of the deadly 2019 protests in Iran, where more than 1,500 people were killed. The protests, led by women, erupted in September after the death of Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old woman who was detained by the morality police for allegedly breaking the country's strict hijab rules.
Maryam, is it true that the regime is saying, well, she just had a heart attack? Like, we didn't kill her. We beat the shit out of her and threw her in a van and took her away, but she sort of died on her own. Is it an act of God argument that they're making, or what?
Well, I mean, the truth of the matter is her family has come out and said that Mahsa was a very healthy young woman. She didn't have any health problems. But also you've got medical evidence that shows that the regime isn't telling the truth. The doctors at Kasra Hospital in Tehran, where she was taken, when she arrived in the hospital, she went in a healthy woman. A few days later, she arrived at Kasra Hospital in Tehran. She was brain dead. And there are images of her skull showing that it was fractured. And it's, Mahsa's case is one of many, because if you look now at the over 500 protesters that have been killed just since September 16th, and they've arrested 18,000 protesters since that date as well. And already 2 of the young protesters have been executed, and there are many more at risk of execution. A lot of the protesters who were killed have that same skull fracture because they are aiming for the head in the same way that they're aiming at people's eyes, at people's genitals. That's just, one of the things that they have been doing during this time and in the past as well. So it's clearly, that it's clear that she was murdered by the regime. And a lot of the other young people who are being killed, the regime, for example, said they threw themselves off the buildings. But there's documented evidence on how they were arrested by the security forces and their bodies ended up in that location. And a lot of the things like suicide, for example, the bodies then, when they're examined, you see that they've got all these sort of fractures that are exactly showing that they were beaten to death or beaten to such a situation as Mahsa was, that she collapsed while she was in there being detained by them. And she had actually been taken there for re-education, because that's one of the things they do to women, and they've been doing it to millions of women every year.
You mentioned the word morality police. I mean, there's a morality police?
Yeah.
Literally a morality police?
Yeah, that's what they're called. They're called the guidance patrols or morality patrols. And what they do is they go in the streets and they arrest women whose compulsory veiling is not on properly, women who might have nail polish on, who might have their makeup on, and also to ensure that men and women are kept segregated from each other. They'll ask for your marriage certificate if you're walking with a man. And also they arrest men who might have too long hair or wearing too Western clothes, that sort of thing. So, but of course their focus, as all religious fundamentalists are, their focus is on women and controlling and policing women. So there's actually a commission for the promotion of virtue and the prevention of vice. I mean, it is Handbook Gilead from The Handmaid's Tale. And these are people who actually go out in the streets and arrest people, and arrest them very violently. I don't know if you or any of your viewers have seen, and listeners have seen, how women are arrested. I mean, it's really brutally, with a lot of brute force, with a lot of violence. Women are dragged by their hair, they're beaten, they're pushed into vans where they're taken away. And it's just a sight it's an unbelievable sight to see that this is happening in the 21st century, in a world where so many rights have been gained by women in quite a few parts of the world.
You mentioned the executions, two public executions anyway. Many more have been killed, but two public executions, I believe, by hanging. The idea then, the regime wants to instill fear in the public. This is what will happen to you if you continue to rise up against us, which means rising up against God. Do you feel like the fear tactics are working, or perhaps they've galvanized the revolution even more? Do you have a temperature on that, Maryam?
I mean, the reality is, look, there are a lot of people at risk of execution. The Iranian regime has done mass executions in the past, for example, in the summer of 1988, where 5,000 political prisoners were executed. And in fact, ex-Muslim organizations established Apostasy Day in August, because it was that summer when many atheists were actually killed. And if you look at that history of that period, you had people being called in to a sham trial, asked, for example, do you believe in God? If they said no, that was at the end of it. They were sent out to execution. If they were asked, do you pray? If they said no, they were sent out to execution. And so, it is possible that they could massacre political prisoners. They've done it in the past. In 2019, there were protests also that took place in Iran, as there have been over the years. In 3 days, they killed 1,500 protesters. And again, they are threatening the sort of mass execution. The Islamic Assembly, out of 290 members, 227 called on the Islamic judiciary to execute all the protesters. And there's 18,000 people who've been imprisoned. Yes, it is to instill fear, and they have been able to do that over the years. But I do think it's different this time, because despite the executions, there's still protests going on. And I want to tell you about one of the men that was executed. His name is Majid Reza Rahnavard. And there's a video of him before he's being executed. He's blindfolded, and the executioners wearing the black masks are standing around him. And he's being interviewed by most probably the Islamic regime state media in order to show why they have a right to execute him. And they ask him, what's in your final will? And he says, in my final will, I've asked. And he's saying this on his way to execution with a blindfold on. In my final will, I've asked that people don't cry over my grave, that they don't read the Quran, they don't recite the Quran, that they don't pray, and that instead they play joyful music and they celebrate.
تو وصیت‌نامه چی نوشتی شما؟
کجا خاکم کنن؟ دوست ندارم گریه کنن سر مزار.
دوست نداری قرآن بخونن، دوست نداری برات نماز بخونن، دیگه
نماز نخونن.
درست.
شادی کنن. آهنگ شاد پخش.
Now, this is the sort of anti-clericalism, the anti-Islamic backlash that we've been talking about for many years. The fact that on his way to his execution, he's clearly saying, don't do this, don't recite the Quran. And in fact, even at Mahsa Amini's grave, a clergyman tried to come, and some of the worshippers said, get out of here, you have no right to be here. So, this is a Generation Z that is fearless, really, inspiring, courageous, and has no illusions to any aspect of this regime. They don't want reform. They want an end to Islamic rule. They want a normal life. And, it's that's why I think this is such a, that's why it's moved so many people across the globe, because in a way, I think you can see yourself in them, and you can see your hopes and aspirations in these young people. And it gives you hope because, for over 40 years, we've had the religious right make our lives a living hell. I'm not talking just about the Islamic right. the Christian right in the United States, in many parts of Europe, the Buddhist right in Myanmar, in Sri Lanka, the Hindu right in India, the Jewish right. They have made lives hell for a vast majority of people, and especially for women, sexual minorities, religious minorities. So to see this sort of uncompromising, courageous, inspiring, modern, human, sort of woman-centered fight back is just something, awe-inspiring, I think. And the other thing that's interesting, and I'm sure you know of this, and I hope some of your listeners would have seen this, it's called the flying turban phenomenon. I don't know if you've seen this, but young people running up behind clergymen in Iran. And clergymen in Iran are like God. They run the country, they make the rules, they are the judges, the executioners, and the state. They run behind them and throw their turbans off. It's called the flying turban phenomenon.
ماشینش به به زن زندگی آزادی مرگ بر دیکتاتور
برو گم شو آخون برو گم شو آخون برو گم شو آخون برو گم شو آخون برو گم شو.
And again, this anti-clericalism, this backlash, and this resistance it's taking various forms, including turban flying. So it's funny because now you see clergy wearing hijabs because they're trying to tie their turbans down so that it isn't thrown off their heads while they're walking down the street. Before they were gods, and now they are afraid of young people.
There are those who deem themselves and their dogmas sacred, and one of the great weapons against that is ridicule. We knock them off their high perch and say, no, we don't have to abide by your rules. Talking about young people, this new generation, I saw a stunning video of a group of young people shouting death to the dictator.
Yeah, I mean, the slogans are really, secular, human, modern, progressive. So death to the dictator, but also we don't want an Islamic regime. We don't want an anti-woman regime. There's a great slogan, which is women shouting, you're the harlot, we're the free women. Because women are often called harlots and, wenches and whores. And the slogan is that it's not being a harlot, it's being a free woman. We are free women. And of course, the ages too, you see really young schoolgirls going out in the streets, removing their hijab. And there's so many videos to this where you see, for example, young schoolgirls kicking out an official from the Ministry of Education that's come to speak there. He has to run out. The schoolgirls just run him out of the school. And of course the risks are great. And, just to give you an example of how risky this is, apart from the 18,000 that they've arrested, the 500 that they killed on the streets, the 18,000 that they've arrested, there are many people who are being disappeared or who are being taken to unofficial detention centers. So there's one, in these unofficial detention centers, there's a lot of reports of rape of the young girls and women. So one young woman, a girl of 14 years, they recognized her via CCTV from the school as one of the girls who removed her hijab. Her name is Masume. She comes from the poorer area, southern Tehran. And she arrived in hospital with, just tears, vaginal tears, and just in a very, very poor situation. She died. And her mother said that she was going to speak out publicly against what happened to her daughter. And now her mother's disappeared. So this has real implications for a lot of people. A lot of people are turning up dead or have been tortured and killed, they're not even in these statistics because they're not necessarily shot on the streets. But again, so I think people understand the extent of risk that they're taking. But I guess one of the things that people are saying is that how many more years do we have to ask, don't execute us, don't kill us? The minute the protests stop, the regime is going to carry on killing. And so at least this is a chance that maybe these young people can bring about change in Iran and bring about a free Iran. And I think that's where we're heading, hopefully.
I think some people thought this would be 2 weeks and it would wane. 3 weeks, 4 weeks, it would wane. And yet it continues. How do you explain that?
I mean, I think, look, this is definitely, in Iran, there have been lots of protests over many decades against the regime. This, of course, is the most clear-cut protest in the sense it has no illusions to any aspect of the regime. It doesn't believe that reform is possible. That's it. It wants an end to the Islamic regime of Iran. And I think what happens is that when people are killed, protesters show up at their memorials, at their funerals. Then in Iran, you have sort of memorials 7 days after someone's been killed, then 40 days after they've been killed. And then there's more people killed, and there's more 7 days and more 40 days. And these have become a way of galvanizing around the issue. And then, of course, now people are being executed, so it's galvanizing around the executions. So I think, it's got a life of its own really now. And it is, I do think that this is the end of the Islamic regime. I can't tell you when it's going to happen, but I think an Islamic regime that cannot enforce veiling on women, because now if you look at pictures and video clips of Iran, there are many women who are going about their daily lives without the hijab. They're sitting in metros without their hijab. They're going to shopping without the hijab. They're sitting in restaurants without the hijab. They're walking in the streets without the hijab. Don't forget, compulsory hijab is a law. You can be arrested, fined, imprisoned because of it. And so here you are, people going about their lives without it. And so, and it is the most visible form of the regime's control. If it loses control, and that's why the hijab is so key in this fight, the fact that this regime came to power by enforcing compulsory veiling, that was its first act it did. And now you've got women burning their hijabs, removing their hijabs, and schoolgirls doing it. So it is the beginning of the end for them. When is not clear, but I do think this is the end for them.
Maryam, I was driving in my home city of Tulsa, Oklahoma, of all places. This was a few nights ago. And I looked up and I actually saw a digital billboard that had Mahsa Amini's hashtag. And it was drawing attention to her plight, and it had the words freedom and women and all those things. The messaging was there. And I was with a few friends and I said, whoa, wow, look at that. To see that here in Red State, Oklahoma is amazing. And they looked at me, all of them, and said, who's Mahsa Amini? And I thought to myself, this is a symptom of the larger problem. Do you feel like the West has a blind spot? In some ways, are we even complicit because we're busy talking about other things?
I mean, I do think that a lot more people know about Mahsa Amini than any other person killed by the Iranian regime, or in general in that region. So many people are killed, but so I think the Mahsa Amini hashtag is the highest trending hashtag in the history of Twitter, and it's been trending for not just for 1 day or 2 days. It has trended over longer periods of time, and you also do see lots of people getting involved and commenting on Mahsa Amini and what's happening in Iran. So even celebrities, people, even the Kardashians, even Starbucks, the Starbucks icon she's cutting her hair. Of course, this doesn't mean that they're wonderfully progressive now. It just means that there is so much attention and pressure that even those who are apolitical, couldn't give a damn about politics and people's human rights, are now listening and paying attention. But of course, a lot more needs to be done. The fact that you know people who don't know who she is, again, it is symptomatic of the fact that a lot of what happens over there is not important, and it is this sort of double standards in the worth of human life. A human life of an American, for example, is worth more than the human life and rights of an Iranian. And I think a lot of that goes back to also this sort of the cultural relativism that we've been seeing a lot of, the identity politics that we've been seeing a lot of, where, it's their culture, it's their religion, it's not our problem. That's what they do. They kill each other, that sort of thing. And I think that's why the revolution, the women's revolution in Iran is so important, because one, it shows that actually we're all the same. We all have very similar hopes and aspirations. Young people in Iran want very much the same things as young people in the United States do. And because of social media, they have footprints. This generation has footprints. We can see what they wanted, what they believed on their Instagram and TikTok pages in a way that we might never have seen before. So I think there's a lot of potential there to break those sort of barriers that exist. And of course, there's also that thing which you know very well, which is this idea that Islam shouldn't be criticized. It's Islamophobic to do so. And that has permeated, in this, they are, after all, criticizing an Islamic state. There is a level of anti-clericalism that might make people feel uncomfortable. But I think it actually helps then to bring things back to where they need to be, which is we should be able to criticize religion and the religious right, challenge it unequivocally whilst defending people.
So December 14th, 2022, the United Nations removed Iran from the Commission on the Status of Women. How did Iran even get on the Commission on the Status of Women? Did you watch that play out?
I mean, exactly. How is Iran on the commission? How was it on the Commission on the Status of Women? I mean, the example I always give is, as if you're going to have the racial apartheid regime of South Africa on the Commission on Racial Equality. I mean, it's so absurd. But again, it goes to show that really governments can do whatever they want to their populations, including, especially if it's over there. And business goes on as usual. A lot of European, Western states have relations with the Iranian regime. They might be critical of its nuclear policy. But, on the issue of human rights, it is very much business as usual. They might make condemnations. But again, what this shows is that this women's revolution in Iran has had such a deep-seated impact that it has forced governments that previously voted for, shall I repeat that? They voted for the Islamic regime to be on that commission, that now a majority of them have voted to kick it out in an unprecedented move. And it goes to show that when there is this powerful movement on the ground, it can shake the entire world. It can change the world, as we've seen in history. And I think this is one of those historical women's revolutions that is the first of its kind, that is going to really bring fundamental changes and challenge not just Islamic fundamentalism, but all religious fundamentalisms in a way that we are all, have been dreaming of and fighting for so many years. I think we're seeing it unfold now before our very eyes. And it's heartbreaking to see all the human tragedies that are unfolding, but also, my gosh, that courage is inspiring, and it makes you feel more courageous and also makes you hopeful that things maybe they are going to change and change very quickly.
Speaking here with Iranian-born, I wanted to put that at the beginning of the show. You do hail from Iran, is that right?
Yes.
What part?
Well, my family's from Shiraz, but I was born and raised in Tehran.
Miriam, you have any thoughts on the World Cup? I know I saw the players who kind of muted their own, I don't know, jingoistic patriotism that you would expect from them, and instead they kind of mumbled the national anthem, and many in the stands from Iran were showing solidarity. They're waving flags that said women, life, freedom on them. You have any thoughts on the World Cup?
Well, yeah, I mean, I thought that Iran should have been banned from the World Cup, because I think that, you cannot go about with sports as usual when people are being slaughtered on the streets and in prisons. I also thought that Qatar should not be a place where the World Cup is held, given its own record of violence against women, violations against women's rights, against gay rights. I mean, Qatar does have Sharia law there, and also its treatment of migrant workers and so on and so forth. And, so I think that for me, I thought, you don't want to ruin football for its fans. Sports can be such a great way of unifying people. But because it's such a great way of unifying people, it also needs to be a great way of, raising the standards of human rights and making it conditional, human rights, basic human rights, respect for human rights, as a condition to being able to have the World Cup and also to play in the World Cup. Unfortunately, Iranians love football, as many people in the world do, or soccer, as you call it in the US. But lots of people were celebrating the loss of Iran because they felt that, Iran should not have been at the World Cup. In Iran, they were celebrating the World Cup. And in fact, a young man was shot dead when he was out in the streets celebrating the loss of the World Cup by Iran security forces.
Is the word still getting out, even though they're trying to shut down the internet? I mean, are there satellite feeds? I saw a terrifying piece of video that someone had shot from a cell phone of, I guess, the morality police going door to door in the middle of the night. This is stuff that Iran doesn't want the world to see, so they're shutting down internet access. But is there still a resource to get this stuff out to inform the world?
Yeah, I mean, I think the internet goes on and off. So a lot of us that have family in Iran still, it is difficult to remain in touch in the way that we were before. But there is ways of bypassing filters and using various technology, which I couldn't explain to you if my life depended on it.
Yeah.
But I'm hoping, just basically that there are ways for people to bypass those. And also, we are living in the age of social media. So what happens, everyone is a citizen journalist. Everyone is passing footage, real life footage, immediately getting the word out. And the regime isn't able to control all of that information, and so a lot of it is getting out. And what you see is horror, the horror and the violence and the brutality of the regime's forces. Just, they come out in herds, the gangs of Islamist herds, the security forces, the Basiji, the Revolutionary Guards, the morality police. They come out on their motorbikes and their cars. They shoot randomly, indiscriminately. They abduct people. There's so much footage of them abducting young girls, especially, and women. There's so many reports of rape. There are threats of execution, and executions have been taking place. Even before this, Iran is one of the execution capitals of the world. And it's one of the only countries that executes minors still. I think the U.S. is one of those countries as well, which is outrageous to think that the U.S. would be on par with Iran when it comes to the death penalty. I think that's something that we should oppose in all instances, no matter what the crime. Obviously, in Iran, no crime has taken place because people are just protesting for freedom. But it is a crime according to the government in Iran. And in Iran, 130 offenses are punishable by execution. So a lot of the protesters are being given execution sentences because of the charge of enmity against God. I mean, you couldn't make it up.
And how subjectively applied could that be? I mean, anybody can, arbitrarily decide that you are a blasphemer and, it's over. But, the flip side of that coin is that we also get to see the images, the video. We get to see and hear the uprising, the defiant,
yes,
those crying for freedom, those throwing off the hijab and the niqabs who are standing against their oppressors, which is, I get goosebumps watching this type of thing. And I've seen it inspire people all over the world, including myself.
Yeah, exactly. So I wanted to say that's one aspect of it. And then in the face of that brutality, you're seeing people with nothing but, their hijabs in their hands, their fists raised, their voices, standing face to face with, weapons of war, because the regime is using weapons of war against a civilian population. And it's no wonder that it has so inspired people. That, I think courage is, what's the word when it's catching? Courage is catching. It's sort of, you see courage, it makes you more courageous. You see bravery. And if you see fear, you become more fearful as well. And so in a sense, you've got this religious right movement, the Islamists in particular, who've ruled not just countries in Iran and Middle East and all by fear, but also here in the West, through their acts of terrorism, through their threats and intimidation, they have made people very afraid of them. So how can you still be afraid of them when you see a schoolgirl facing this monster with her hijab in her hand, or showing the middle finger to a portrait of Khamenei, who's the supreme spiritual leader? That's his title. That's how absurd theocracy in the 21st century is. And it helps us understand, I think, fundamentally that, one, we're all the same, but two, cultural relativism and identity politics is pure bullshit, if you can excuse my language, because what it shows is that actually, what people want is universal, our hopes are universal, and all of this sort of tiptoeing around criticism of Islam and Islamism has been at the expense of people's rights and lives, and they're not taking it anymore. And I think, that in and of itself is hugely hopeful.
Which brings me, I think, to my final question. What can we do? I can hashtag it, right? I'm a slacktivist. I know raising awareness does have its value. But beyond that, how can we help? How can we contribute?
Yeah, it's interesting. Today I was talking to this woman who's a actress and a theater producer, and she was saying that for the first time in her life, she felt that she could make a difference because she's watching those young women and girls and feels like if they can do it, I can do anything, basically, because I live in a freer society where my voice will have more of a reach and I'm less at risk to do so. And I think that there's so many ways in which people can support the women's revolution in Iran. Look, one of the first things is, of course, the hashtag. Keeping that hashtag alive is important because then more people will know who Mahsa Amini is and what's going on in Iran. The other example is putting pressure on our own governments, the governments where we live. So you in the United States, for example, I live here in Britain, so the British government. Look, if you look at this example that you just gave, where Iran was expelled from the Commission on the Status of Women, the first time a state has ever been expelled from the Commission on the Status of Women was because people like you and I put pressure on our own, the states where we live, saying you have to vote to expel the regime. And when they felt enough pressure, they had enough courage to expel the regime, especially if you think about who voted the regime in. 4 democratic countries voted the regime in. We don't know who they are, but based on numbers, we can see that 4 countries, either from North America or Europe, voted for the Iranian regime to be in the UN Commission on the Status of Women. And this time, none of them voted for it. So that pressure makes a difference. The other thing we're asking is, look, there has to come a time where it's not enough to just condemn. You have to shut down the Iranian embassies. You have to break diplomatic ties. You have to expel the ambassadors. These are all the things that happened during the anti-apartheid movement, where it reached a point where Western governments that were collaborating and cooperating with the racial apartheid regime of South Africa decided they can't do it anymore because it was too embarrassing for them. There was too much public pressure and demanding that they stop. And that became the beginning of the end of the apartheid regime. You know, Nelson Mandela was called a terrorist by the British government, by Margaret Thatcher. And then he was welcomed here as a hero because of that pressure. And so, you know, writing to your papers, writing to your MPs, to your congressmen, to your senators, joining rallies, it's really great to see non-Iranians join the rallies because it just shows that it is a universal issue. Getting the word out. There's so many different ways in which people can show their support and solidarity. And I think any little thing helps, and it all adds to this groundswell of, you know, support and solidarity for people and against the regime. And that's what we need for it to reach such a stage where the regime cannot survive any longer.
As we enter the new year, hopefully a new and better chapter for Iran as we watch history unfolding before our eyes. Thank you for educating me and this audience, giving us a greater depth of perspective. We'll continue to watch and listen and spread the word and hopefully contact everybody around us and encourage them to do the same. Maryam Namazie, you are amazing. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Seth. You are amazing. And thank you for getting this out there and also for all the work you do over the years. And thank you to your listeners and viewers for taking the time to listen to this, and hopefully it will spur them into action.